Every time I pass through airport security, I feel the weight of unspoken judgments. People weigh you with their eyes, evaluating every movement, every glance. It's a quiet scrutiny, as if your mere presence demands justification. This day was no exception. I stepped through the security checkpoint, my briefcase in hand, when I noticed him, a white police officer standing by the check-in counter, staring at me a little longer than he did at anyone else. His expression was calm, yet there was something predatory about it. Something in his eyes said, "This isn't going to end well for you." I'd grown used to that look. It's the kind of gaze that can make the world shrink around you, turning a bustling airport into a stage where you're the unwilling star of a drama about to unfold. Still, I kept walking. Years of experience had taught me to stay calm under pressure, even when the world around me seemed determined to disrupt my peace. But that day, something felt different. My instincts told me this wasn't just another uncomfortable moment to brush off. That look, his unrelenting gaze, felt like the beginning of a storm. I was on my way to Chicago, a business trip as routine as any other. The flight was one of dozens my airline operated daily. Yes, my airline. That small detail, one the officer couldn't have known, would change everything. But for now, I let him follow his script. The officer began to move. His boots echoed on the polished tile floor. His eyes locked on me. I could feel the weight of every step he took, his intent clear long before he reached me. He didn't bother with introductions. "Let me see your documents," he said, his tone flat and authoritative. Wordlessly, I handed him my passport and ticket. Around us, people slowed their pace. Sensing the tension, he studied my papers, his brow furrowing slightly as though he were searching for a reason to justify his interest. "Where are you flying?" he asked, still staring at the documents. "Chicago," I replied evenly. "For what purpose?" His voice was colder now, probing. "Business," I said, keeping my tone measured. He closed my passport, his grip on it firm, his expression unchanged. He didn't hand it back. Instead, he grabbed my arm, his fingers pressing tightly against my sleeve. Without a word, he began leading me toward his patrol car. I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Strangers whispered, their curiosity ignited by the unfolding scene. But I stayed calm. There was no point in resisting. This wasn't the time to explain myself. Not yet. The police car was parked just outside the terminal. He opened the rear door and gestured for me to get in. I complied, sliding into the seat and settling against the stiff upholstery. He climbed into the driver's seat, his movements methodical, and glanced at me in the rearview mirror. There was a smugness in his expression, the confidence of someone who believed they held all the power. But then I spoke. "Do you want to know who I am?" I asked, my voice calm. The corner of his mouth curled into a smirk. He didn't reply, clearly expecting some outlandish excuse or a desperate plea for leniency. "I'm the owner of this airline," I said evenly. The smirk vanished. His face froze, his eyes widening as the weight of my words sank in. For a moment, he was silent, the realization crashing over him like a wave. He turned his gaze forward, his jaw tightening. The illusion of control he'd carefully maintained began to crumble. The ride to the police station was heavy with tension. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, avoiding any eye contact through the rearview mirror. His earlier confidence had been replaced by an uneasy silence. I let him stew in it, giving him time to reflect on the gravity of his mistake. There was no need to rush. The wheels of justice, after all, were already in motion. By the time we arrived at the station, I was composed, my inner calm unshaken. He led me inside, his movements stiffer now, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. Other officers glanced my way, their expressions mirroring the same mixture of suspicion and judgment. None of them knew who I was, and I decided not to enlighten them just yet. My lawyers were already on their way, and I had no doubt they'd arrive on time. Inside a small, windowless interrogation room, the officer began filling out paperwork, his hands trembling slightly. He avoided looking at me, though I could feel his unease radiating across the cramped space. I sat back in my chair, watching him, my silence deliberate. How much longer? I finally asked. He looked up briefly, then returned his focus to the papers in front of him. He didn't answer. I could see the cracks forming in his facade. The realization was dawning on him that this wouldn't end the way he expected. His usual playbook wouldn't save him this time. Then I delivered the first blow. My lawyers are already on their way, I said, my voice steady. He froze, his pen hovering above the paper. His face paled, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. He understood now that this wasn't just another routine stop. He had entangled himself in something far beyond his control. When my lawyer arrived, the dynamic shifted completely. She entered the room with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to dismantle the situation. "Can you explain why you detained my client?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The officer stammered, struggling to string together a coherent explanation. I was following protocol," he mumbled, his voice unsteady. "And are you aware," she continued, her words sharp and deliberate, "that my client is the owner of the airline for the flight he was scheduled to board?" His face turned ashen. The room fell silent, the weight of her statement settling over him like a shroud. He had no response, no defense that could justify his actions. The station's police chief entered shortly after, his expression grim. He glanced at me, then at the officer, his displeasure evident. "I've been informed of the situation," he said, addressing my lawyer. "Rest assured, this matter will be handled appropriately." The officer was asked to step outside, leaving the three of us alone. The chief turned to me, his tone apologetic. "This is a very unfortunate incident," he said. "Please accept my sincerest apologies. I assure you, we'll take immediate action to address this misconduct." In the weeks that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed about the airline owner detained by a prejudiced officer, sparking national outrage. Videos of my press interviews circulated widely, with people praising the case as a turning point in the fight against systemic bias. But for me, this wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about using this platform to shine a light on the broader issues that allowed such incidents to happen. The officer who had detained me was suspended and eventually dismissed. His career unraveled as the consequences of his actions caught up with him. While I felt no joy in his downfall, there was a sense of justice in knowing that his unchecked behavior had finally met its reckoning. Months later, as I stood before an audience at a human rights conference, I reflected on everything that had transpired. "This isn't just my story," I said, addressing the crowd. "It's the story of countless others who have faced discrimination and injustice, often without the means to fight back. It's a story about the power of accountability and the need for systemic change. And it's a reminder that prejudice, unchecked, can destroy lives, not just the lives of its victims, but also those who act on it." The room erupted in applause, but I knew the work was far from over. This victory was just one step in a much larger fight, but it was a step forward. And for now, that was enough.